It bursts in the air above us. The German artillery observer wrote the words in his notebook on December 19, 1944, outside the village of Elsenborn, his pencil shaking not from cold alone. He had heard shells his entire adult life, whistling, screaming, thudding into mud. This sound was different. There was no warning shriek, no impact. Just a sharp crack overhead, like a giant snapping his fingers in the sky. And then, men began falling without visible wounds. By the fourth day of the Ardennes offensive, the forest itself seemed to be killing them. The American artillery batteries dug into the frozen ridgelines east of Malmedy were firing the same 105mm shells they always had. The guns recoiled, crews shouted corrections, powder smoke drifted low among the pines. Nothing about the cannons looked new, but inside some of those shells was a device so secret that U.S. Navy freighters carrying them had been ordered to sink themselves rather than let one be captured. It was called the VT proximity fuse. At 05:30 on December 16, 1944, when German forces smashed through the thin American lines in the Ardennes, the weather worked in their favor. Low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. Snow muffled sound. Dense fir forest swallowed visibility. For German infantry of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and armored spearheads of Panzer Lehr, the woods offered protection, trees to break shrapnel, trunks to hide behind. That assumption would cost them dearly. By December 18th, U.S. artillery units supporting the 99th Infantry Division near Krinkelt-Roquerath began receiving unusual fire orders. The shells were to be fused not for impact, not for delay, but for airburst. Gunners didn't know how the fuse worked. Most weren't told. They were only warned, handle carefully, don't drop it, don't ask questions. When the first rounds detonated above the tree line, German soldiers instinctively hugged the ground. It didn't help. The proximity fuse worked by emitting a small radio signal. When that signal bounced back from an object, earth, snow, or a man's body, the circuit closed. The shell exploded at chest height. In forests, it was worse. Tree trunks reflected the signal perfectly, causing shells to burst just below the canopy, spraying fragments downward like a steel rain. Men were hit in the face, the neck, the shoulders, places helmets and foxholes could not protect. A grenadier from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division later described it during interrogation near Liège. The shells did not hit the ground, they hunted us in the air. By December 20, as German columns pushed toward Bastogne, American artillery around the perimeter, units of the 10th Armored Division and elements of the 101st Airborne Division began using proximity-fused shells defensively. The snow around Bastogne was already churned black by weeks of traffic and blood. Temperatures hovered below freezing. Foxholes were shallow because the ground was too hard to dig. When German infantry probed the American lines near Foy and Marvy, the air above them erupted. There was no crater to avoid, no pattern to read. Shells burst above road junctions, over hedgerows, directly over marching columns. Men dropped their weapons and pressed their faces into the snow, only to be hit from above. By December 20, as German columns pushed toward Bastogne, American artillery around the perimeter, units of the 10th Armored Division and elements of the 101st Airborne Division began using proximity-fused shells defensively. An artillery officer from Panzer Lehr, wounded near Neuville on December 21st, reportedly asked his captors if the Americans had developed a new radar weapon. He could not accept that a shell fired miles away could decide on its own when to explode. Psychologically, the effect was devastating. German training had taught soldiers how to survive artillery, spacing, foxholes, movement. The proximity fuse erased those lessons. Forests were no longer shelter. Snowfields offered no safety. Even retreat became dangerous as shells burst over roads and trails, catching columns in motion. American forward observers noticed it immediately. A lieutenant with the 320th Field Artillery Battalion, supporting the 35th Infantry Division, wrote in a letter dated December 23, 1944, "They don't bunch up anymore. After the airbursts, they crawl, even when they should be running." By Christmas Eve, as the Germans launched desperate assaults to break the Bastogne encirclement, proximity-fused shells were used in some sectors almost exclusively. Over Assenois, German infantry advancing in tight formation were shredded before reaching the wire. Bodies lay face down, helmets blown off, rifles still slung. The sound became a signature, a flat, violent crack in the sky, followed by screaming that rose and then faded into the wind. German medics struggled. Wounds were complex, multiple small penetrations, shattered jaws, blinded eyes. Frostbite set in as men lay immobile, afraid to move under continued airbursts. Morale reports from 5th Panzer Army units noted unexplained heavy losses, even when American positions were not visibly engaged. By December 26, 1944, when General Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne, German momentum had already bled away. Fuel shortages mattered. Air power mattered once the skies cleared. But in the forests, in the snow, during those crucial first days, the proximity fuse had quietly tilted the balance. What stunned German commanders was not just the lethality, but the implication. If the Americans could do this, if their artillery shells could think, could sense, could decide, then the technological gap was wider than anyone had feared. Rumors spread of radio shells and automatic detonators. Some officers worried the Allies had unlocked something fundamentally new. They were right. After the war, captured German reports repeatedly referenced the same phenomenon: airbursts in woods, impossible to evade. The proximity fuse, used sparingly before, proved decisive in the Ardennes because the terrain magnified its cruelty. For the men on the ground, there was no theory, only sensation. The snap overhead, the sudden pressure in the ears, hot fragments cutting through frozen air, and the realization, creeping and awful, that the sky itself had turned against them. In the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were not only pushed back by tanks and infantry, they were hunted by explosions they could not predict, in forests they could no longer trust, by a weapon they never saw and barely understood, until it was already too late.